This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. For thousands of years, the human imagination has been plagued by the image of the wolf in the moonlight. Whether it's a fearsome monster, a wicked sorcerer, or some hideous combination of man and beast, nearly every culture around the globe has invented some sort of a shape-shifting monster. And in one shape or another, this werewolf monster has stood the test of time, shifting and changing with each new generation to become the manifestation of their darkest fears. While our contemporary conception of the beast is based largely in stories and poems like the ones that I just recited, the Hollywood-era beasts splashed across a silver screen, there was once a time when the werewolf was thought to be a very real and very present danger in a lot of people's lives. The werewolf may not have the renown or the flair of something like the vampire, but as a scapegoat for mankind's most terrible urges, our most taboo impulses, they remain a foundational part of the landscape of monstrosity. It seems that no matter how much we try to repress this monster, no matter how much we try to laugh it off or forget it, the wolf will always return when the full moon rises. So I ask that you would join me this lovely Halloween night for a look back through the blood-stained pages of history to learn a little bit more about how the illusion of human civility can only be maintained by maintaining these ancient, modern monsters. Come along, and don't forget your silver bullets. Before we crack in, I want to issue a warning that this video is going to contain some dark topics. These include, but are not limited to, gore, violence, cannibalism, and sexual assault. So if any of those are particularly triggering for you, maybe skip this video, and if there are any children in the room, usher them out, send them out to go trick-or-treating or something. Also, later on, when I begin talking about specific pieces of media, I will put up timestamps when I start talking about the thing, just in case you want to avoid spoilers for that topic, because there is a risk I'll spoil anything that I talk about, and those will also be available in the description if you need to check them out there. And one more warning, I'm about to talk to you about the people that make videos like this possible. This video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. And you can get your website discovered fast with Squarespace's integrated SEO tools. Every one of their websites is optimized to be indexed with meta descriptions, an auto-generated sitemap, and more. All the things that you need to show up on search engines and bring in more customers. And with Squarespace, it is so easy to monetize what you make. You can sell access to online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. All you have to do is set the price and choose between charging a one-time fee or a subscription. It couldn't be easier. If you're interested in refreshing your existing brand or establishing a totally new one, Squarespace is the place to do it. Just head to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. And while I would love to begin this video by establishing a singular definition for werewolf, I'm afraid that's not going to be possible. These monsters and the myths they arose from are constantly in flux throughout time and space. There was never one singular definition for a werewolf in history, just like there isn't one today. I suppose that we could try and say that a werewolf is a person that turns into a wolf. But even then, that definition starts to fall apart, because the earliest mythic murmurings of what we now consider werewolves didn't even involve wolves at all. All the way back in 75,000 BC, we find evidence of what we believe were the very first human-created religions, and these often revolved around or involved the worship or reverence for animals, especially bears. This can be found across the globe. early art and altars depicting animals, most especially whatever the dominant native predator was in the area of the people that were worshipping. In North Europe and East Asia, this was the bear. In South America, we find an interest in jaguars. From Japan, we find ancient tales of spirit possession by powerful foxes. And yes, sometimes wolves would make it into the mix of prehistoric religion. It's now believed that back then, they saw the dividing line between human and animal as a much more blurry thing. In fact, a lot of early creation myths have humans evolving or being created from already existing animals. The idea that an animal might possess or become a human, or that a human might take on the shape of an animal, either literally or metaphorically, was not a strange one to most prehistoric people. In fact, the practice of shapeshifting may have been an important part of early religious enlightenment. Somewhere around the year 12,000 BC, prehistoric French people painted this figure in a cave. It seems to depict a being with antlers, a long human-esque beard with the tail of a horse or wolf. Now referred to as the sorcerer, this cave painting seems to depict some kind of an early shaman figure, a religious guide who would use the skins of animals, or perhaps embody and act out the traits of animals in order to gain religious enlightenment, or to communicate religious ideas. Now we should note the beginning of a running theme here, that throughout history it has been very difficult to look back and determine what exactly people meant when they talked about shapeshifting. Modern science gives us the impression that human beings cannot actually physically transform into animals or vice versa. But it is possible that people of the past thought that it was possible to physically transform into an animal, but it is also possible that they meant shapeshifting in a more metaphorical and non-literal sense. Maybe they meant shapeshifting by saying that someone was dressing like an animal, or making the noises of an animal, or turning into that animal in their dreams. Maybe they used meditation, music, drugs, or dance in order to put them into an animalistic state. We just can't know one way or another whether they thought shapeshifting was a literal practice or if it was more of a metaphorical, spiritual one. Either way, we do believe that there were practices wherein members of prehistoric society, especially hunters, claimed specific animals and tried to imitate them, and this included wolves. In his book, The Beast Within, Adam Douglas theorizes that this practice arose from the need for humans to bolster their strength and their confidence before a hunt. You see, humans are not natural-born killers. We don't have the teeth of the tiger, we don't have the claws of a bear, or the tusks of a boar. The only reason that we made it to the top of the food chain is because we were able to work together, using our ability to run really long distances for really long times to literally run down our prey to death. Seeking to become more like a bear or a tiger, the long-limbed yappers that were our ancestors may have used community activities such as dance or music to basically hype themselves up before they went out on a hunt. And if you were looking for a specific killer to embody, the wolf was not a bad choice. It was well known that they rarely attacked humans or other large animals unless in cases of great desperation. They would prefer to scavenge, to carefully hunt, rather than to glut themselves on the largest kills possible. Just like man, wolves were willing to wait. They were willing to be cunning, to work together, and to share the fruits of their labor within the pack. Although they weren't as popular as bears, wolves became a potent symbol for the prehistoric warrior, and we might very well call these hunters that embodied wolves in their hunting the very first werewolves. Adam Douglas even proposes that the moon may have played a very prominent role in the lives and rhythms of these early hunters. Hunting wasn't something that needed to happen every day, and back then the only marker you had for the passage of time beyond the unit of a day was the moon, or the year. And so perhaps 28 or so days after the last hunt, when the moon was high in the sky and the night was bright, humans would howl at the moon like wolves as they went out on their full moon hunts. The historicity of that specific image is debatable. We don't have proof that that happened, but the idea that that could have happened has left a lasting imprint on the human imagination. The earliest story reference we find to something that might be considered a werewolf can actually be found in the earliest story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Babylonian tale from 2000 BC, makes mention of a man being turned into a wolf by a woman as a punishment. It is a very brief mention and kind of a throwaway, but it does imply that the concept of someone being turned into a wolf was present from the very earliest roots of our storytelling tradition. In the Odyssey, composed sometime around 850 BC, we find all kinds of shapeshifting, men becoming beasts to reflect their internal vice. In these early days, being forced to transform into a wolf was almost always seen as a punishment, the internal predatory vice of this person being given external form as they are turned into a literal animal. Shape-shifting and werewolf accusations were also a very useful tool outside of stories to alienate others. Around 500 BC, we see reports coming in from the Scythians that their neighbors, the Neuri, were werewolves. This also came with some cannibalism accusations towards them. The pattern goes like this. For whatever reason, you don't like your neighbor. And what's the worst thing that your neighbor could possibly do that would get other people on the side of disliking them as well? Well, cannibalism is a pretty bad thing, and what eats human beings? Wolves. Is it possible that your neighbors are so absolutely depraved, so ruined as a people, that they actually turn into animals and eat human beings? Just a side note, don't go around accusing your neighbors of being cannibals, they will call the cops on you. So it is that the very first rumors of werewolves spread as a kind of scapegoat, a way to take humans' most beastly actions and make them the actions of actual beasts. It meant that we didn't have to take responsibility for them as humans. Around 40 BC, in one of his stories, Virgil makes very brief mention of a sorcerer that uses magical herbs to become a wolf, perhaps a reflection of earlier shamanic practices. This is also significant because it is one of the very first instances we see of someone willingly and intentionally becoming a werewolf or a wolf, not because of the result of some kind of a curse. As early as 55 AD, we start to find werewolf stories that contain tropes that would eventually develop into the familiar werewolf tropes that we know today. In Petronius's Satyricon, he tells of a servant who goes out to philander with his girlfriend while his master is gone. For safety, the servant brings a soldier with him to guard him along the road, but as they're making their way to his girlfriend's house, the soldier stops suddenly at a roadside graveyard. The soldier strips his clothing off, he urinates in a circle, and then he turns into a wolf and runs off. The servant is terrified, and he goes to gather up the soldier's clothing, but he finds it heavier than stones, unable to be moved until its master comes back and reassumes his human form. Note that the werewolf must or chooses to change at night, and there's also mention made of how bright the moon is, because without the moonlight at night, how would the watcher see the transformation? The soldier also chooses to make this transformation by a set of graves, just like so many modern werewolves are associated with graveyards. The soldier must also remove his human clothing, his human skin first, before he can take on the skin of the wolf. The idea that someone must take off or destroy their human clothing to transform into the werewolf, plus the idea that someone must re-put that clothing on to reassume human form, is also something that would appear in a lot of later stories. The soldier urinating in a circle, while a little bit goofy, also implies that there may be some kind of magic at work, because it is a common thing to see in magic that you must lay out some kind of a circle before a spell is performed. While the werewolf story from the Satyricon may not quite be Universal Pictures level of werewolf story yet, it did lay a lot of the groundwork for the myth to come. But werewolves did not just exist in the realm of fiction. They were also thought to be a very real medical danger. In 650 AD, the term melancholic lycanthropia was coined, and it was used to describe patients who suffered from pallid skin, dry tongues and eyes, ulcerated legs, and the compulsion to wander around at night and to howl. But what's notable is that the person writing about this condition did not attribute these symptoms to a curse or to any of the other explanations of myth such as magic. Rather, he attributed this to an imbalance of the humors. At the time, medical wisdom stated that the human body possessed 4 humors, substances that must stay in balance if health was to be maintained in the body. In the case of melancholic lycanthropia, the symptoms were brought on by an excess of melancholic bile, or black bile. This resulted in this animalistic, wolf-like behavior, ulcerated legs from walking around on all 4s. Suggested treatments for this illness included things like a controlled diet, bleeding, and the use of opium, although they were pretty much using opium for a lot of stuff back then. From this point onward, the werewolf tradition evolves in 2 separate branches. On the one hand, there is the werewolf of myth and legend, the cursed skinwalker shifting from human to wolf. And on the other hand, there was medical lycanthropy, which was thought to be a genuine medical condition that just so happened to convince people to act as, or to think that they were acting as, wolves. It is hard to say if this condition of medical lycanthropy actually had a lot of serious medical backing behind it, but the mere fact that up until the very end of the 20th century, we were still diagnosing people with medical lycanthropy, it makes you wonder if these were recurring symptoms enough that it was something that doctors should engage with. It wasn't until 1020 that we find the first written evidence of the word werewolf being used in the ecclesiastical ordinances of King Canute. There, it was dictated that the shepherd of God must defend his flock against "ze wordfreka werewolf, tu swede ne slide, ne tu fele ne abite, of godskunde heode." Now, this first werewolf use case is very obviously metaphorical. Throughout the Bible, they refer to the children of God as sheep, and to those who do them harm as wolves, and nowhere in this text does it imply that the lycanthropes of medical understanding or mythological understanding had anything to do with the werewolves to which they briefly refer in this passage. But this does set up an interesting comparison that would be very fruitful in later years: the idea of the werewolf being connected to the activity of Satan. No longer were werewolves just a mythic monster, now they were demons of the devils, collaborators in the corruption of human souls. We can see this religious bend strengthening as the great Saint Patrick was said to have turned naughty pagans into lycanthropes. Apparently, as St. Patrick was going around 5th century Ireland evangelizing, in one town the pagans were unreceptive to the Christian message, howling at St. Patrick like dogs to try and drive him off. St. Patrick prayed to God, and God responded by cursing those pagans with lycanthropy, to turn into wolves for 7 straight years. But not all werewolves were cursed or punished by their condition. In the Bisclaveret, a 12th century Old French poem, King Arthur hears the tale of a man who can turn into a werewolf when he undresses and turn back into a human when he redresses, much like in the Satyricon. The man, named Bisclaveret, tells his wife about his condition, but the wife is a cruel woman who takes away his clothing one day when he changes, forcing him to remain in wolf form as she goes off and marries another man. Bisclaveret befriends a neighboring king, gains his trust even as a wolf. At one point he even has a wolf lover, and then he plots to take down his deceitful wife. The idea of a bitter or jealous woman somehow being involved in the werewolf curse is a very lasting one. By the height of the medieval period, werewolves were taking shape in the medical tradition, in the storytelling canon, and in the pages of religious doctrine, but they would find a lot of inspiration in the tales and myths of Northern Europe, where shapeshifters played a large role in their stories. The Old Norse sagas used the word hammer to mean shape, and they would use this word to create a lot more words. For example, a strong magician would be referred to as hamrammer, which means shape strong. Hamask means to fall into an animal rage, while hamfarir was used to describe a shape journey, where someone would go to sleep or go into a trance, and while they were dreaming, their soul would leave their bodies and take on the shape of an animal. From language alone, you can tell that changing one's form and taking on the shape of an animal was considered a very potent part of their magical tradition. In their stories, you would see magicians or gods putting on the hammer of an animal and thus assuming that animal's forms and attributes. Sometimes this would be used by the warrior in battle to enhance their skills, which is where we get the idea of the berserker. The term berserker comes from the word berserker, which means bear skin, because most of these warriors wanted to emulate bears. Berserkers would get together and work themselves up into a frenzy and thus turn into these animals. If you want a really good example of how this may have looked based on all of the research that we have, I highly recommend you check out this scene in Robert Eggers' The Northman, or realistically you should watch the entire movie because it is very, very good. But you can see the way that ceremony and environment and music would have helped these warriors work themselves up into the berserker form. By putting on the skins of bears or of wolves, these men became the animals. In that moment, they were werewolves. And it is quite telling that some of these warriors chose wolves as the animal of their transformation. After all, wolves weren't exactly entirely positive creatures within the myth. They were scavengers. They would scrounge the bones of the battlefield to gobble up rotting human flesh. In fact, the term vargur meant wolf, but it also meant outlaw, someone who had done something to human society to the point where they were no longer included within human civil society. But clearly this negative perception was not all-encompassing, considering that the stars of the 13th century Volsunga saga, the Volsung family, were known as the Wolflings. In one story, a Volsung father and son went out to the woods and found the pelts of wolves left behind by other shape-changers. By putting on the skins, they take on the shape of wolves, and they agree that they will go their separate ways, but if either of them faces more than 7 men at once, they will howl for the other to come and help them. They go their separate ways, but then the son runs across 11 men altogether. He's taken by passion and by confidence, and he defeats these 11 men, but when his father comes to him and realizes he did not follow the word of their vow, he attacks and nearly kills his son. The son's life is only spared by the intervention of the god Odin, and the two decide to burn the wolf skins, so that none might follow in their mistakes. This suggests that perhaps shape-changing into a wolf was seen as a kind of rite of initiation. This was how the son set himself apart from his father, running as one of the wolves of Odin to prove that he could be the animal, but that he could also turn back into the human. Whether they literally became wolves or they just embodied them doesn't matter to the story. This appears to be a key initiation rite, all built around the notion of transformation, of going beyond the bounds of the human and seeing what is beastly within the man. There are many other stories, even some included in the Volsunga saga itself, that don't paint wolves in such a flattering light. Brothers turn on brothers when they're in wolf form, and there is the giant wolf that will consume the moon at Ragnarok. We see a pattern emerging that the Old Norse werewolf is a different kind of werewolf to the nice civil ones such as Bisclavret. Bisclavret's story is all about him being a man that happens to be trapped in the form of a wolf. The Old Norse stories imply that beastliness is something that humans will latch onto if they're given the opportunity. No matter how civil or noble the man was before his transformation, once the Vagshammer was put on, all bets were off. He may very well descend into monstrousness. But this transformation wasn't always seen as an outright bad thing. For a warrior family of legend like the Volsungs, perhaps they needed to touch that darkness, to see what they were capable of, in order to prove that they truly could live as humans. It was a trial by fire, and that meant that some people burned out, but those that came out the other side were stronger than ever. Although Norse werewolf stories had faded out by the end of the medieval period, the berserker a thing of the past, the imagery, tone, and the intent of the Norse werewolf left a lasting impression on the human imagination. This powerful pagan monster would be especially impactful as Christianity swept over the continent, forever altering people's perception of the past. By the 12th century, Christianity was the dominant religion in Europe, but it didn't simply erase or try to forget all of the old stories. Rather, one of the reasons that Christianity spread so quickly and so thoroughly is that they had the practice of taking the existing legends and stories of a place and Christianizing them. This is why the extant manuscript of Beowulf is obviously an older pagan story, but it has been rewritten through the Christian lens. This is why so many modern Christian holidays have a lot of residue left behind from older Roman pagan holidays. And so it was that the werewolf was also integrated into the Christian system of belief. In this new worldview, werewolves were evil. If they were someone actually transforming into a wolf, they had gained that ability by making a deal with the devil. And if they weren't actually transforming and they were just deluded into thinking they were transformed, that was because the devil was getting into their subconscious and affecting the way that they thought. No longer did werewolves live in a kind of ambiguity, a kind of dark initiation rite, or sometimes even a beneficial thing. Werewolves were, on the whole, regarded as evil. And following the medieval period, evil of this sort was routed out through witch hunts. Despite popular belief, witch hunts actually were not a relic of the medieval period. Rather, they started picking up steam in the 1400s, just as the medieval period was coming to a close and the Renaissance was beginning. In fact, during the medieval period, the church declared it to be heresy to even believe that it was possible for a person to shapeshift or do witchcraft. But as famine set in, as plague became widespread, as science began chipping away at the edges of superstition, and as the Protestant Reformation shaved away at the once very solid pillar of Christianity, friction arose that would soon blaze into a fire. Werewolves and witches go together like two peas in a pod, and by the mid-1400s, werewolves were often being brought up in witch trials. Early reports cast these werewolves as familiars or steeds, but by 1462 we get the first mention of a witch using a special ointment to turn into a wolf. This wasn't really out of the blue at the time. Witches were being tried for having familiars in the forms of dogs, cats, or rats, and they often were accused of using ointment to do things like fly. Werewolf trials alone, in which the person was being accused of being a werewolf rather than being a witch, weren't particularly common, but by the 16th century, it would be very surprising if literature about witches did not include some mention of the werewolf. In many ways, werewolves ended up being the male counterpart to the witch. Women with their herbs and poisons and deals with the devil were witches, while men who had made similar covenants and used similar magic were thought to be werewolves. And thus, like witches, they were hunted. The gruesome truth of 15th through 17th century witch trials is that they really allowed for a very rapid proliferation of stories. We now have reason to believe that most, if not all, of the people accused of being witches and werewolves didn't actually believe the things that they were confessing to. There were no real witches and there were no real werewolves, which means that these people, as they made their desperate confessions, as the people accusing them of witchcraft put more and more absurd stories in front of them that they agreed to, it ended up being like a kind of really sick, creative fiction writing exercise. One driven by desperation, but fiction all the same. Trouble would befall a small town, plague, famine, or animal attacks, and without any other solutions, you'd start to look around for someone to blame. Of course, it's easiest if you pick someone that's not really involved in society. Someone who's poor, someone who's outcast, someone who is too old or disabled to contribute to society in any more meaningful way. You would take that person to the witch hunter, and the witch hunter would come up with a story that that person should agree to if they want the torture to stop. And the more lurid that story was, the better. Not only did that bolster the reputation of the witch hunter, but it also made you, the person accusing them, feel a little bit better. You know, this might just be some old widow who lived on the outskirts of town, but she had also kissed the devil's ass and eaten children and stuff, so certainly she deserved torture and death. And make no mistake, nearly, if not all, of the confessions made during the witch and werewolf trials were made under duress. Oftentimes, a witch interrogation would begin by sitting the accused down and showing them the vast assortment of torture methods that awaited them if they didn't confess. The accused would then be presented with a whole written-out list of accusations and stories and deeds that they supposedly did, and all that they would have to do to get the torture to stop is say yes. And I think that anyone being presented with thumbscrews, drowning, or crushing by stones would probably prefer to simply say yes to the confession they were being pressed for and be quickly hanged, rather than face the witch's hammer. Witch hunters would construct these confessions based off of other stories that they'd heard, which were also made up and which were also made to seem as gruesome and reprehensible as possible, and you can see the way that this legend would build. It's hard to say who truly believed everything that was being said, but it did make for a very good story. And in the case of the werewolf, where the accused were often male and thus capable of even greater, more violent atrocities than women, these stories became absolutely absurd at points. The fact is that people like a good story, and they like that story even more if there's the illusion that that story is true. There's a reason that true crime is so profitable these days. If you want to see a movie that I think really captures how the witch trials went and how these stories escalated, I highly recommend the 2020 movie Coven, or Alcare, I believe in the original language. Alcalare, sorry. It's kind of like The Crucible in that it is about a witch trial, but I think it's done even better and with even more historical grounding, so be sure to check that out. This caveat is all to say that I'm about to tell you about werewolf trials, and they're going to sound absurd and wild, but you have to remember that these people often were not writing their own confessions, and also these people were tortured, old, or disabled, and just didn't really know what was going on enough to properly protest these accusations. History and stories are deeply interwoven, and in cases like that of the werewolf, fiction often ends up being far more important than fact. Our first notable werewolf trial is that of Gilles Garnier in 1573. In a remote French town, children began turning up dead, brutalized by what they initially assumed was a wolf. But as these attacks continued, as more children ended up dead, they began to look for someone to blame: a werewolf. The perfect scapegoat for their fear ended up coming in the form of Gilles Garnier, a local hermit. When they hauled him in for questioning, he even confessed to meeting a mysterious figure in the dark woods, who gave him an ointment that would allow him to turn into a wolf. He confessed to taking the ointment, and while in wolf form, he slaughtered the children and ate their flesh, and even allegedly brought some home for his wife to eat. For his crimes, Gilles Garnier was burned at the stake alive. A veritable werewolf frenzy was quickly working itself up, especially in France, and this is in part because the 1500s in Central Europe were just a really terrible time. Famine and plague were at their worst, and although this was supposedly the Renaissance, People looked around at the starvation, hunger, and darkness, and they did not see a world reborn. It was reported that as bread grew scarce, people began falling upon horses, donkeys, and roadkill like animals, scavenging the bones much like wolves. And it wasn't particularly crazy to go from there and think that humans in this state of mind might also eat people. But that was a very tough and very uncomfortable pill to swallow, and in fact it was easier to say that the devil did it. It was easier to believe that man had been demonically transubstantiated into a monster than that man himself could have been the monster all along. Still, there were some people that swam against the wave of superstition that was cresting. In 1584, Reginald Scot put out The Discovery of Witchcraft, where he actually tried to get witches and werewolves off the hook by explaining that their condition wasn't brought on by the devil, but by an imbalance of the humors. Scott believed that the influence of the devil was powerful, but that the age of miracles had ended with the last of the apostles, and the devil didn't have the ability to fully flesh and blood transform someone from man to animal. Thus, this mental state of believing they had been turned into a werewolf must be brought on by poor health, and he used the terms lupina melancholia and lupina insania to describe this condition. Some physicians took on another approach, suggesting that imbalanced humors could leave people weak and thus more open to diabolical influences, but as always, it's important to remember that the past is not a monolith. Just as there are people today that believe in absurd conspiracy theories, and then there's a whole nother group of people that go along with those conspiracy theories because it's easier or it's just what everyone else is doing, and then there's also a contingent of people trying to use the science of the day to disprove those conspiracy theories. Just like today, in the past, human belief and knowledge was a really wide spectrum. Because just as Reginald Scot was proposing that the activity of werewolves was not actually their fault, people were still being executed for the crime. The case of Peter Stube, brought to trial in 1589, was a landmark case when it comes to werewolves. Also known as Peter Stump or Peter Stube, Peter was a German man who was convicted of sorcery. He said that he had a magical belt that allowed him to transform. He became a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body and mighty paws. And no sooner should he put off the same girdle, but presently he should appear in his former shape, according to the proportion of a man, as if he had never been changed. After a years-long rampage, killing people, pets, and livestock, Peter was finally brought down by a pack of dogs. These dogs chased him down, and in an effort to escape, he took off his magical belt, transforming back into a human. The hunting dogs scattered, but the people who had been in pursuit saw him change, and were thus able to bring him in for questioning. Of course, somehow during the arrest, the belt was conveniently lost and never seen again, but that didn't matter, because as soon as he was on the rack, Peter began confessing to a number of increasingly lurid crimes. On top of accusations of incest and sexual assault, he was accused of killing some 13 young children, even ripping 2 from their mothers' pregnant bodies. As a punishment, Peter wouldn't just be burned at the stake. He was strapped to a wheel, attacked with red-hot pincers, he had his limbs crushed, and he was finally beheaded on October 31st, 1589. Happy Halloween! News of Peter's incredibly sensational case spread like wildfire, and with the widespread use of the printing press, this spread was only accelerated, proliferated across the continent, becoming the fodder for superstitions in many places, and in a way, acting as the first step towards unifying the scattered notion of the werewolf. Because Peter wasn't just the tragic victim of devilish delusions. At the time of his arrest, he actually wasn't even accused of being a werewolf. He was accused of being a sorcerer, who intentionally transformed into a werewolf in order to commit these violent crimes. However, as his legend spread, and as time played its compressive role, Peter Stubb became the face of this era's werewolf, calling into question the accountability that man has when he becomes a beast. As S.J. Wiseman puts it, Stubb Peter has the likeness of a wolf, but becoming a werewolf does not involve the magical disillusion of the border between man and animal in this story. Rather, it suggests the coexistence of the wolf's likeness with the soul and reason of the man. Around this time, we also get the incredibly informative trial of Jacques Roulet. As plague and famine decimated his town, the hermit and beggar Roulet was found crouched over the body of a 15-year-old boy, covered in blood from his mouth to his hands, with the boy's stomach ripped open. Roulet was dragged in for questioning, where he ended up confessing that his parents had given him an ointment some years ago that helped to facilitate his violent deeds. The court reports read, "When rubbed with this ointment, do you become a wolf?" "No, but for all that, I killed and ate the child Cornier. I was a wolf." "Were you dressed as a wolf?" "I was dressed as I am now. I had my hands and face bloody because I had been eating the flesh of the said child." "Do your hands and feet become paws of a wolf?" "Yes, they do." "Does your head become like that of a wolf? Your mouth becomes larger?" "I do not know how my head was at the time. I used my teeth. My head was as it is today. I have wounded and eaten many other little children. I have also been to the Sabbat." Now, what's interesting here is just how Roulet skirts around these questions. It's been suggested by modern scholars that Jacques Roulet may have actually been either developmentally disabled from birth, or he had had his cognitive function damaged by epilepsy throughout his life. But either way, you can see the way that he is not the one leading this trial. He's not really the one making confessions. He's just agreeing to the story that's put in front of him. Perhaps when Roulet was agreeing to have been in the form of a wolf, that was more of a metaphorical thing. He confessed that his hands and feet had become that of a wolf because they were covered in the blood and guts of a child. And what human would be like that? Is that not more the behavior of a wolf? Or maybe he was just confused, and he was agreeing to the questions put before him to have it all end faster. Maybe he had done these things. I'm not trying to excuse what he may or may not have done, but I also want to point out that he was most certainly scared, hurt, hungry, quite possibly deeply mentally ill, with no way to contextualize or to explain the mental illness he was suffering from that we don't even fully understand today. Although the first trial of Jacques Roulet ended with him being sentenced to death, this was later reviewed by a higher court, and he was instead sent to a mental hospital for 2 years. We don't know what happened to him after that, but we do know from his story that pain, hunger, desperation, and a fervent desire for a body story could have mortal consequences. Werewolf and witch hunts claimed quite a few victims, but by the 1600s they were mostly beginning to burn out, especially in places like France where they had been the most intense. But as was often the case with these cultural phenomena, although the initial hotspot burned itself out, the echoes of this hunt and of its tales would spread out to all the far corners of Europe, where they would morph in some very interesting ways. For example, up in Livonia by the Baltic Sea, we can find claims of people claiming to be non-demonic werewolves. A man there said that he had been a werewolf all of his long life, stating that he had annually led a contingent of werewolves down into hell, where they would battle against the devil and his demons and witches to help keep them at bay. This man was brought to trial anyway, and he was imprisoned, but it does imply that outside of the French epicenter of the werewolf phenomena, there was a more flexible version of werewolves at work. There was perhaps still the residual idea of a werewolf that wasn't all evil. In fact, in areas such as Croatia, we see stories lasting well up into the 1600s of warriors that would exit their bodies at night and walk in the form of animals to do benevolent deeds. The variation of the werewolf was even more diverse outside of the bounds of Europe, especially in America and especially up in Canada, where native beliefs around the relationship between animals and humans combined with the beliefs of settlers to create a new and very interesting monster, the Loup-Garou. In Native American myth, there was a considerable degree of fluidity to be found between man and animal. There are stories of shape-shifting, although that shape-shifting was typically animals turning into humans rather than the other way around. There were stories told of humans and animals marrying, especially bears, and there were a lot of stories of children being raised by wild animals. There's also quite a few tales of humans being turned into prey animals like deer or salmon in order to teach them how to properly hunt, conserve, and live in harmony with that part of the ecosystem. So even before colonizers arrived, there was a pre-existing idea that the barriers between man and animals were a very permeable thing. But especially in Canada, French people came over and brought with them their ideas of shapeshifters. As their beliefs merged and clashed with each other, the Loup-Garou began to encompass entirely new questions. Was nature or civility to win out? Was native religion or Christianity the true faith? Colonizers thought of themselves as the people bringing light and civilization to a dark corner of the world, but what of those people who were already there? Who were watching their worldview, their beliefs, their spirituality be trampled over by these newcomers. The Loup-Garou evolved to encompass the fears of these colonizers, and in stories where they took on or defeated the beasts, or when those beasts ripped out the throats of their so-called civilization, they had something on which their worst fears and their greatest desires could be projected. Thus, as the werewolf proliferated across an increasingly globalized world, it absorbed everything from native traditions to contemporary fears, morphing to become a scapegoat and a teaching tool about everything that society ostracized in order to maintain an illusion of civility. And as the werewolf became such a ubiquitous and established myth across so much of the world, many modern scholars have looked back and tried to figure out why? We now know with relative certainty that people were probably not turning into wolves. But why then, for like 300 years, did people believe in this myth so fervently that they were willing to kill for it? Well, the very first thing to consider when humans start acting in bizarre and inexplicable ways is, of course, drugs. Witches' ointments were often reported to contain toxic substances such as wolfsbane or nightshade, which in small amounts might cause hallucination as they poisoned you, so perhaps this was like the medieval equivalent of bath salts, and all these people were just getting really high on ointment and then going around and tearing things up as wolves. But the problem is that these ointments only ever come up in about 4% of werewolf witch trials, and even then, when they are brought up, it's in the context of a trial, and these ointments were well established to be used by witches, and so that's why they were getting brought up in the trials. If all of these people were doing drugs, getting high, and thinking that they were werewolves, you'd think that it would come up more often that that's what was happening. Of course, we can't make a definitive statement that drugs were never involved in cases of supposed lycanthropy, but we don't have any research that suggests that this ointment was as popular as it seems they would have to be for this to be the main reason behind the witch-werewolf trials. Okay, so drugs are out as a potential explanation. What about something more organic, such as ergot poisoning? Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye, and we know that it often spread in medieval and Renaissance Europe. While not every form of ergot is poisonous, there are certain mutations that can cause effects similar to LSD while they're poisoning you. That means pain, fever, nausea, muscle spasms, and hallucinations. The argument connecting ergotism, that is poisoning by ergot, to lycanthropy, basically just says that the bizarre behavior seen in lycanthropy cases may have been caused by outbreaks of ergotism. But one of the main issues with this is that modern research shows that if ergot causes you to go into a fit or a trance where you're hallucinating, once you come out of the fit, you are able to look back on the fit that you just had and recognize that it was a fit. Even if, in an ergot-induced haze, you imagine that you were a werewolf and you ripped some people apart, once you had come out of that trance state, you wouldn't think that you had turned into a werewolf, you would have thinked that you had hallucinated turning into a werewolf. In most of our witch-werewolf trials, this was not a dimension added to the story. People still firmly believed, or said that they believed, that they had been werewolves. But there is also the fact that in the medieval and Renaissance period, people were aware of the effects of ergot, because in certain circumstances it was used as medicine, as an abortifacient, and so if there was a significant connection between outbreaks of lycanthropy and outbreaks of ergot poisoning, they would have been aware of it. They weren't stupid. Modern science has also tried to explain werewolves with rabies, which I do get, because symptoms of rabies include snapping jaws, muscle spasms, strange behavior, foaming at the mouth, and rabies is transmitted by animal bites. Now, a couple of problems here, because rabies kills you. You die if you get rabies within just a couple of days if you make it that far. Whereas cases of werewolves and lycanthropy often could last weeks or months, and it wasn't known to be a fatal condition. People had to be executed, and if they had rabies, they would have just died long before the trial could have concluded. Plus, you have to think about the fact that the main argument for rabies being lycanthropy is that it's transmitted by bites, just like werewolves, but the idea of werewolves being infected by being bitten by an animal or by another werewolf was only developed in the 1930s, and certainly wouldn't have been a thing back in the Renaissance period. Other diseases have been brought into this conversation, such as porphyria. Porphyria is known to cause discolored reddish urine, discolored teeth, and ulcers across the skin. And people who suffer from porphyria are also very much more sensitive to the sun, so they only want to go out at night. Plus, this condition was known to be very common in places like Switzerland, in more mountainous areas, where werewolf accusations were also quite popular. But I don't really think there's any good reasoning here. I mean, porphyria doesn't make you go out and eat children. Having discolored teeth does not make you howl or crawl around on all fours. Now, could there have been a case where someone saw someone suffering from porphyria and it sparked their imagination about werewolves? Yeah, of course that could have happened. But say it with me, correlation does not equal causation. I could go through another dozen attempts from modern scientists to try and explain why lycanthropy was such a widespread thing, but really I think we should be questioning why we need an explanation for it at all. In 1963, a Dr. Illis was one of the major proponents for trying to find a modern cause for lycanthropy. He writes, "A belief as widespread, both in time and place, as that of the werewolf, must have some basis in fact. Either werewolves exist, or some phenomenon must exist or have existed, on which, by the play of fear, superstition, and chance, a legend was built and grew." And you know what? I am hardly qualified to be disagreeing with a doctor here, but I think he's wrong. I don't think that lycanthropy has to have an explanation based in fact. There did not have to be one medical phenomena that can easily explain away this belief, because I think Dr. Illis is forgetting here the sheer power of belief itself. It is truly amazing just how much humans are able to accept a good story, a comforting story, when they're desperate enough. Werewolves and the persecution of werewolves emerged because there were things that people couldn't explain. There were certain aspects of human nature, exacerbated by plague, famine, and fear, that just scared us so badly that we would prefer to believe in something like werewolves than to believe that we were capable of those things. It is far easier to say that the devil made them do it, that an animal took over them, than to accept that humans can be that animalistic. Yes, it is entirely possible that things like drugs, or rotten grain, or obscure diseases could have added some fuel to this fire, but this was a fire that was started by us, because we as humans love stories. And it makes sense then that as true belief in the reality of the werewolf was phased out, werewolves found a new home in tales. One of the earliest werewolf stories to find widespread acclaim was the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. And yes, I would argue that this is a werewolf story. Yes, most modern iterations, and even iterations of the past, only ever refer to the wolf as a wolf, but it is also a wolf that's able to talk, and in many versions of the story, it is a wolf that is able to trick Little Red into thinking that he is a human, so I think we're on fair grounds to call him a werewolf. Plus, the werewolf connection becomes even more explicit when we look back to how this tale used to be told. The first version of this story to be published was by Charles Perrault in 1697, but we're fairly certain that this story was based on even older oral tradition tales. These stories all follow a general framework, you know the story, the little girl in the woods. On her way to Grandma's house, she meets a wolf along the way and that wolf sets a trap for her. But in some of these earlier versions of the story, there was cannibalism involved. When the wolf gets to Grandma's house, he kills Grandma, and he starts cooking her up. Little Red arrives, and he offers her a snack of Grandma. These early versions of the story also typically come to an end with Little Red climbing in bed with the wolf, sometimes burning every item of her clothing before she does so. From there, the wolf either eats her, or Little Red outsmarts the wolf by pretending to need to relieve herself, going outside, and escaping from there. Ideas of violence, cannibalism, and the beast that may lurk within a man have always been present in this story. But it also nods to lycanthropy in the ways that Little Red acts as a warning to little girls against witchcraft and behavior that is associated with witchcraft. She's told to follow the rules, to stay on the path, not to wander into the dark where she might meet a male figure offering her something that she wants. Although Perrault's published version of the story cuts out the cannibalism part, it does conclude with Little Red crawling in bed with the monster and being eaten. In the moral of the story that closes the whole thing out after Little Red is in the wolf's tummy, he warns, "Children, especially attractive, well-bred young ladies, should never talk to strangers, for if they should do so, they may well provide dinner for a wolf. I say wolf, but there are various kinds of wolves. There are also those who are charming, quiet, polite, unassuming, complacent, and sweet, who pursue young women at home and in the streets. And unfortunately, it is these gentle wolves who are the most dangerous ones of all." Clearly, this story was intended to be a warning against young women about the danger that could be lurking in any and all men. They might seem civil or charming on the surface, but who knows what monstrosity they could be hiding under the covers. As werewolves were becoming more and more the fare of stories, as animals retreated to the forests and humans to their cities, the beastly form of the werewolf began to be used to address social dangers beyond mere violence or cannibalism. But clearly, the bone-deep fear of wolves had not been eradicated, because at the end of the 18th century, in Gevaudon, France, a new beast was going to rear its hideous head. Starting in late 1764, reports began flooding in from the province of Gevaudon of a monster that was like a wolf, but not like a wolf, terrorizing local people and livestock. As women, children, and men began turning up dead with signs of brutal animal attacks upon their corpses, a frenzy of fear rivaling the 15th century witch hunts began to mount. Theories emerged that the beast of Gevaudon was a terribly unnatural animal crossbreed, that it was a punishment from God, and even that it was a human moving under the guise of the wolf. It was claimed to have huge claws, huge teeth, glowing eyes, spines going up its back, and one man who narrowly escaped with his life even claimed to have seen a line of buttons going down the creature's front, as if it had merely tossed on the skin of the wolf before it assumed this form. This was a widespread and earnest enough concern that the Crown of France sent professional wolf hunters there to deal with it. They drummed up volunteers and would go out with thousands of people hunting for this beast. Eventually, they caught and killed a large gray wolf, which they paraded around, claiming that it was the beast, but not everyone believed that, and certainly we don't necessarily believe that the wolf was solely responsible for these attacks today. From 1764 to 1767, the beast was thought to have taken around 50 souls. It seems that even in a modern, enlightened society, there's still room to fear the beast. Still, werewolves were mostly relegated to the realm of stories after this, although it wasn't until the mid-1800s that we first started seeing serious literary endeavors that involved werewolves, and the very first one was W.M. Reynolds' Wagner the Wehr-Wolf. In this story, Wagner is a werewolf, someone who made a bargain with a stranger to regain his youth at the cost of the consumption of human souls in wolf form. Now, unfortunately, this book was just not very good. Wagner doesn't really follow any of the established werewolf rules. Not that there were established rules at this point, there was no one canon, but he doesn't draw from any mythical basis, and his rules are so specific and his lore is so specific to his book that it wasn't really able to be integrated into the cauldron of story to be used in later stories. For example, in this story, the werewolf curse can be healed by seeing 2 skeletons hanging off of a beam, which doesn't make for a very good story, but would make for a pretty cool Halloween decoration. This first foray into the werewolf novel was inventive, but it was perhaps more a lesson in what not to do than what to do when it comes to creating a modern monster. Early missteps such as this set the werewolf aside as a very unique kind of monster, because for the lycanthrope, there is no text. Unlike Dracula or Frankenstein, there is no Mount Fuji to which every following monster of this kind must either refer to, adapt, or intentionally disregard. Even today, werewolves still find their greatest representation in film, and before that they found their footing, or pawing, I suppose, in the realm of short stories. Like fairy tales of old, I kind of find short stories to be the perfect formula and size for telling a compelling werewolf story. There's enough time to hint towards the lore and the background, there's some really great space to build up tension, and then the story snaps to a close, just as the jaws of the creature finally close around its prey. In the 1860s, George MacDonald put out The Grey Wolf, which follows a student stranded on a remote Scottish island due to a storm. He seeks shelter in a cave where he sees a beautiful but strange young woman with dark hair and very gray skin. She leads him to the house of her mother, where her mother cooks the student a meal, but the whole time as the student is eating, the girl is watching him with hunger glinting in her eyes, even though she refuses to eat any of the cooked food. The student keeps noticing strange things. The girl leaves the house for a moment, and all of a sudden on the stones outside, he hears something that sounds like a dog's paws walking around. In the candlelight, the girl's face seems to change, hair sprouting on her face, her nose elongating, but when he blinks, the illusion is gone. That night, everything goes downhill when the man is awakened by an animal attacking him. He grabs it by the throat and scares it off. But the next morning, when he sees the girl, she has bruises on her throat, the very same bruises he left on the animal the previous night. She shifts before his eyes, turning into this great gray wolf, and she attacks him, and the student narrowly escapes with his life, running away to freedom as she wails and sobs behind him, mourning her lost prey. This is one of the very first examples we see of the female werewolf. While werewolves were predominantly seen as male during the werewolf witch trials, the concept of the female werewolf offers some tantalizing possibilities. After all, the woman werewolf could be seen as a temptress. As frightened and confused as the student is by this girl's bizarre behavior, he is attracted to her. There's something intriguing about her animalistic qualities. It's also easier to find a weird kind of pity for the poor female werewolf, wailing and weeping as her prey escapes her grasp. The prevailing ideas and theories about women at this time mix like oil to water with monstrosity, shaping a creature that is much more difficult to write off as solely monstrous. Our next female werewolf comes a few years later in Sir Gilbert Campbell's The White Wolf of Kostopchin. This story features a man banished from high Russian society, forced to live out the rest of his days on an estate in Lithuania. The man is miserable here, drinking himself to death every day, until a local hunt for a murderous wolf turns up something quite strange. A beautiful woman with long red hair and a white fur cap, who claims to be a political refugee just like him. The man, Paul, is immediately taken by her beauty and her grace, and he invites her to come live in his home, and he also invites her to love him. He offers her his heart. The woman is playing it a little bit coy, though, and she insists that if he wants her to fall in love with him as he has fallen in love with her, he must come visit her every night to try and woo her. Every night he comes to her like a dog, begging for her attention. She becomes his entire world. He even ignores as his own son is terrified by this woman. He doesn't care. He just wants to give her everything. This tale, of course, ends as any good love story should, with Paul giving his heart to his love. It was then that the full horror of his position came upon Paul Sergeyevich, and he saw his fate clearly before him. But a terrible numbness prevented him from using his hands to free himself from the hideous embrace which was paralyzing all his muscles. The face that was glaring into his seemed to be undergoing some fearful change, and the features to be losing their semblance of humanity. With a sudden, quick movement, she tore open his garments, and in another moment she had perforated his left breast with a ghastly wound, and, plunging her delicate hands, tore out his heart and bit at it ravenously. The woman is shot by Paul's son, but it is too late for him. They come upon their corpses, Paul's human corpse lying next to the body of a great white wolf, clutching his human heart in its paw. While the White Wolf is certainly a villainous character, I would say that she's far more cunning than bestial. The male werewolf was typically portrayed as a monster, barely contained by the rules of human society, but this female monster seems to be mostly human, but plagued with inhuman, unwomanly desires. She is beautiful, elegant, intelligent, and well-spoken, but she has hungers that must be satisfied at any cost. In 1891, we actually get a female werewolf written by a female author in Rosamund Ball Marriott Watson's A Ballad of the Werewolf. The poem tells of a man coming home to his wife and wondering why she looks so upset. After all, he's just come home from a hunt where he's finally caught the wolf that killed 2 of their children. He wasn't able to kill the wolf, but he was able to cut off one of its paws. He tosses the pouch containing the paw onto his wife's lap, where it falls open to reveal not a wolf's paw, but a human hand. And then he watches in horror as his wife rolls up her sleeve. She stretched him out her long right arm, cold as the dead stood he. The flames looped bright in the gloamin' light, but there was nae hand to see. Of course, as it turns out, the wife was the monster all along, and it was her hand that he had cut off. And I think that Marriott Watson knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote this story, because what could be more horrifying than the truly monstrous woman? It is so deliberate and concise in its horror, because she knew that the most horrifying concept in that particular day and age is a woman who could do something like kill her own children. In a society where women were supposed to be these serene, ultimately motherly figures, these perfect paragons of womanhood, what could be more awful than a woman who is the antithesis of all of that? As the storytelling tradition deepened, medical lycanthropy was also making strides. In 1914, Sigmund Freud published a paper on a patient he called Wolfman. This man had been born under strange birthing circumstances on Christmas Day, among other things, which in the area's superstition meant that he could be a werewolf. Freud thought that this man's adulthood delusions were brought on by a nurse that he had had as a child who was very superstitious, who may have impressed this curse upon him by constantly worrying that he might turn out as a werewolf. Thus, as an adult, that is what the man thought. Now, werewolves could also be found on the silver screen as early as 1913 in a film simply titled The Werewolf. This silent film tells the story of a Native American woman becoming a wolf in order to wreak vengeance on colonizers. This film is now considered lost media, but it was loosely based off of a short story of the same name by Henry Beaugrand. Now, the story does enforce some pretty harmful stereotypes, the savage Native American versus the peaceful white settlers, but it did break the ice on future werewolf movies to come. In 1933, Guy Endore published The Werewolf of Paris, which is probably the closest thing that we'll ever get to the definitive basic werewolf text. This is a gothic horror that follows Bertrand, a boy conceived through assault, born on Christmas Day, and thus cursed by uncontrollable violent and sexual desires. These manifest as transformation into a wolf. As he tries to live life, fall in love, and find satisfaction, Bertrand constantly self-sabotages and ruins any chance he might have at happiness. In the end, he tragically takes his own life, brought to the brink of madness by his own uncontrollable nature. Although it would never reach widespread acclaim, The Werewolf of Paris would do a lot to establish the tone of werewolf films to come, especially early Hollywood werewolf films. In 1935, the major motion picture The Werewolf of London was produced by Universal Pictures. In this story, a high society, tightly buttoned scientist is bitten while on a trip to Tibet, and he accidentally brings the werewolf curse with him to the streets of London. Unable to resist his violent urges, he is killed to halt his rampage. This film would later be overshadowed by its offspring, but it did do a lot to establish some familiar tropes of the genre. For example, this is the first time we see the werewolf curse being transmitted by one werewolf biting a non-werewolf person. And this was a very useful tool, because in the past, werewolves were either cursed because they did something wrong, they were like that from birth, or it was something that they intentionally chose to do. And all of these things made for a less sympathetic character. But someone that wasn't born with it, a regular person who had done nothing wrong, suddenly being stricken by these terrible urges, by this awful transformation, it made for a very sympathetic character, despite the evil deeds they were committing. This would all reach its peak in 1941's The Wolf Man, Universal's second attempt at a werewolf picture. This film was made in the shadow of huge monster hits like Dracula and Frankenstein, and it stars Lon Chaney Jr., the son of Lon Chaney, a well-acclaimed makeup artist and actor in early silent film Hollywood. Chaney plays Larry Talbot, who's returning from life in America to his father's Welsh home. There, Larry falls in love with an antique saleswoman, Gwen, who sells him a cane that has a large silver wolf's head at its top. Gwen warns him of the local legend of the werewolf, and recites to him the poem that I began this video with, which suggests that every man, even the most faithful and good man, can become a werewolf when the circumstances are right. Larry and Gwen go out together to get their fortunes told. The fortune teller is of course played by Bela Lugosi of Dracula fame, but everything goes downhill from there quickly. They hear screaming along the way, and Larry goes out to save a girl being attacked by a monstrous wolf. He beats it to death with his silver walking stick, but he's bit during the conflict. But when the dust settles, and everyone comes to see what the commotion is, it's not a wolf lying on the ground dead. It is the fortune teller, beaten to death by Larry. As Larry's wolf bite heals miraculously fast, suspicion begins mounting, many suspecting that Larry may have gone mad. But the fortune teller's mother soon comes out to tell Larry that he wasn't crazy. The fortune teller had been a werewolf, and now Larry was to become one as well. It's too late for him though, and Larry begins to undergo terrible physical changes, gruesomely depicted, and he goes on nightly rampages in wolf form. When he finds out that his beloved Gwen is to be his next victim, Larry begs his father to send him away to prison, or at the very least chain him up so that he can't go out on the prowl, but his father thinks he's mad. As a final effort, Larry insists that his father take with him the wolf's head silver cane on his nightly hunt, And when Larry inevitably transforms and breaks out of the house, it is his father who has to beat him to death. The Wolfman established a number of werewolf tropes that are now taken as a given in the werewolf canon. The use of silver against the beast, the importance of sorcery symbols like the pentagram, the look of the werewolf, and especially pity for the werewolf. Larry is the perfect protagonist for this kind of movie. He's not perfect, he's a bit brutish and blundering and ignorant, but there's a naivete that comes with that. You can kind of feel that this is the first time Larry's dealing with something that he can't understand, something he can't muscle or pay his way out of. He has no introspection to fall back onto when everything that he knows about the world begins falling apart around him. As opposed to the intentionally sinister werewolves of earlier myths, Larry is truly cursed by his lycanthropy, by its tragic randomness. As the mother of the fortune teller says,
"The way you walked was thorny, through no fault of your own. But as the rain enters the soil, the river enters the sea. So tears ran to a predestined end."
The Wolfman was never a runaway hit in the same way that Dracula and Frankenstein were for Universal, but he was popular enough that despite his death at the end of this movie, he keeps coming back in many later monster movies. He returns for Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, where kind of Palpatine style, he's just not dead anymore, and then he has to go through a whole nother journey of tragic self-realization, being tortured by his curse, before I believe that at the end of that one he's also killed again, but he's back later, don't worry. He makes another appearance in House of Frankenstein, where he is killed by a silver bullet for the very first time in werewolf mythos. But then he also comes back for House of Dracula and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He had been thoroughly canonized into the ranks of Universal Pictures' most beloved monsters. By the 1950s, the werewolf was a well-known mythic monster, the very best kind, one that appeared to have a foot in the past, while striding boldly for a more contemporary image. In 1957, we got I Was a Teenage Werewolf, which, to no one's surprise, is about a teenage werewolf. It stars Tony, an unfortunate teen with severe anger issues, who just can't seem to get a hold of his more primitive urges. When he gets yelled at school multiple times and beats up a guy for pulling a simple prank on him, his girlfriend and his father convince him to get help from a psychologist. But this doctor, as it turns out, has ulterior motives. He wants to use Tony as a guinea pig for his new drug, which will supposedly revert the human mind back to a more primitive state. Through using this drug, he hopes to be able to rebuild society from the ground up. He secretly injects Tony with the serum, which turns him into a werewolf when his most violent impulses get the best of him. Teenagers begin dying in horrific bloodbaths, and of course, in the end, the scientist gets his comeuppance as his own creation kills him. The movie ends with the message that we should not try to interfere in the matters of God. I Was a Teenage Werewolf establishes a very strong connection between the werewolf myth and the idea of primitive or regressed man. It addresses mounting fears at the time over teenagers and the nasty business their urges might bring them to. Tony is a troubled kid, his mother is no longer around, and without any real guiding figures in his life, and without even a doctor to help him, he ends up falling prey to his most violent impulses. I would argue that this movie begs some of the same questions that Reginald Scott was asking back in the 1500s. If someone's terrible deeds are genuinely caused by an imbalance, by some kind of a medical issue within them, how accountable are they, or should we make them, for those actions? Once again, the werewolf is acting as a kind of scapegoat, an outside area for us to examine the kind of things that we find destructive within ourselves. Through the 1960s, the werewolf tradition carried on strong through films such as Werewolf in a Girl's Dormitory, exploring the idea of the truly predatory man. In 1961, Hammer Films took on the legend, actually adapting The Werewolf of Paris from 1933 for a truly gory, yet sympathetic horror flick. Outside of the realm of Hollywood by the 1970s, we also see the peak of modern-day medical lycanthropy diagnosis. Symptoms of lycanthropy were believed to include an altered state of consciousness, alienation from human society, acute stress and anxiety, beastly compulsions, and an obsession with the demonic. Cases diagnosed as lycanthropy often involve patients exhibiting animal-like behaviors or claiming to have turned into animals or morphed into animals due to external causes such as stress, social pressures, and suicidal ideation. Oftentimes, these lycanthropic fits would be triggered by the use of drugs such as LSD. But it was really hard to diagnose people with lycanthropy because it didn't really mean anything particularly specific. Some cases diagnosed as lycanthropy involve patients not thinking they had turned into wolves, but things like rabbits or guinea pigs. The fact is that they eventually began to realize that lycanthropy wasn't really a diagnosis in itself, so much as a description of symptoms of something else. While conditions like anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia could manifest as an end result in behaviors that were described as lycanthropy, there was no one specific illness that could cause or trigger it. Rather, lycanthropy acted as a release, an opportunity for troubled people to get out their rage, their sexual appetites, and their violence, all of the things that civilized society required that they bottle up and hide. While lycanthropy kind of ran its course in terms of being a useful diagnosis, the fact that up until the end of the 20th century we were still diagnosing people with lycanthropy proves that we're not all too far off from Renaissance scholars and doctors. As much as we'd like to claim medicine and science and literature as very separate disciplines, the fact is that especially in cases like lycanthropy, the crossover is perhaps more than a lot of people would be comfortable with. But movies and medicine were not going to be it for this tradition, and in short stories, werewolves were alive and well, especially the female werewolf. In 1979, Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber contained 3 different werewolf short stories, each pricking uncomfortably at the borders of familiar fairy tales. In the story simply titled The Werewolf, we see the classic image of the little girl on her way to grandmother's house. Along the way, she is stopped by a wolf, but this little girl has her father's hunting knife hidden in her basket. She takes it out and cuts one of the wolf's paws off, and as it flees away in terror, she tucks it into her basket for safekeeping. When she arrives at Grandma's house, she finds Grandma acting strangely, so she pulls the blankets back from Grandma's bed, revealing the festering stump where her hand once was. The tale concludes: the child crossed herself and cried out so loud the neighbors heard her and come rushing in. They knew the wart on the hand at once for the witch's nipple. They drove the old woman, in her shift as she was, out into the snow with sticks, beating her old carcass as far as the edge of the forest, and pelted her with stones until she fell down dead. Now the child lived in her grandmother's house. She prospered. This is a deeply uncomfortable retelling of the Little Red Riding Hood myth. Without any present male characters in the story, the male-female dichotomy set up by so many earlier versions collapses completely. It seems so completely unnatural to see the old wolf grandmother attacking her own grandchild. It's so strange to see Little Red be the one carrying the knife and hacking away at flesh and blood. It seems so terribly unnatural that this little girl would just take over her grandmother's house and prosper, like nothing had ever happened. There isn't time or effort built towards fostering pity in this story for either of the characters. Neither of them are really sympathetic. They both just seem so cold and unwomanly. This discomfort only builds in Carter's next werewolf story, The Company of Wolves. This story is constructed from a number of mini short stories, one of the most prominent ones being yet another Little Red Riding Hood retelling. On the way to grandmother's house, this girl meets a handsome man in the woods who challenges her to a race to the destination. The wolf scurries off to grandmother's house. He of course arrives first, where he kills grandmother and takes her place. But when Little Red arrives and realizes that it is the wolf there and not her grandmother, she flips the narrative. She strips off all of her clothing, tosses it into the fire, and intentionally seduces the werewolf. The werewolf can't eat her then, because it is she who has claimed him. This short story doesn't try to deny us our male-female dichotomy, but it does refuse to give us a digestible moral. Although it's following along in the footsteps of the traditional fairy tale, Little Red is not doing any of the things that she should be doing. She is not a helpless victim defending herself from the predator. She offers the wolf a kiss earlier. This is something that in some way she wants. She doesn't naively strip her clothing off and join the wolf in bed. That is something that she chooses to do in order to wield her feminine power over the now helpless male. She ends the story within the claws of the wolf, but really it is the wolf who is now in her claws. She has, in a way, become the predator. I definitely won't try and claim this to be an unproblematically pro-women narrative. The fact that Little Red, or the Little Red equivalent, has to weaponize her sexuality and her femininity, the fact that she has to sleep with this wolf in order to spare her own life, isn't necessarily a win for feminism of any sort. But it does prove that, at least in Angela Carter's world, there's no such thing as a simple victim. She has no interest in presenting you with a digestible or easily comprehensible story. She's using the familiar patterns and shapes of the fairy tale, but is challenging the morals that those fairy tales propose in a number of ways. And this really comes to a peak with her third wolf short story, Wolf Alice. This short story follows a feral child who's raised by wolves and is then found by nuns that attempt to civilize her. When these attempts to civilize Wolf Alice fail entirely, she's sent off to live with a monstrous duke, a man who only wakes at night and steals corpses from graveyards. Throughout the course of this short story, we watch as Wolf Alice does learn a certain kind of civility, the kind of civility that only she can teach herself. She looks in the mirror to learn what it is to have another person in the room to talk to. She looks in the mirror to learn her sense of self. She comes around to the conclusion that it's better to wear clothing, but that's not because of decency, it's because of utility. And this very unique kind of civility that she constructs, these social rules that she builds herself, turn out to be more accepting, more genuine, and more loving than anything that the nuns could have taught her, because she develops the kind of mindset that even allows her to accept someone like the Duke, and to begin to civilize him. Angela Carter's wolf stories stand out because they staunchly refuse to tell any message that we might have heard before. She doesn't want to just reiterate things that these werewolf stories have been used to say in the past. She wants to find new fears. She wants to find new ways to address these fears through these modern fairy tales. She is pulling deeply from traditions in all of these stories. Even Wolf Alice, which seems relatively original, is based off of a much older version of the Little Red Riding Hood story. By telling, retelling, and rewriting these stories again and again, Carter forces us to examine these tales on a level deeper than the surface. What is it that we should be teaching little girls? What is it that we fear in the werewolf that we should perhaps fear in man and in woman? What should we be seeing in our own reflections? And which unquestioned and unexamined rules of our society might be doing us more harm than good? Around this time, other female authors were also flipping the script on the werewolf story, and this included Ursula K. Le Guin in her 1982 short story, The Wife's Story. Now, this is one of those short stories where I do recommend that you read it before I spoil everything about it, because it has a really great twist ending. It's really short, it's like 10 minutes, and it is available for free online if you Google it. So this is me officially giving you permission to stop doing your dishes or folding your laundry, put all of that down, pause this video, and go read The Wife's Story, and then come back and continue the video. The Wife's Story opens by lulling you into a false sense of security, by presenting you with a fairly standard werewolf narrative. The female narrator meets a man who's a bit strange, but he's tall, he's charming, he sings beautifully at their community gatherings. The two of them fall in love and move into a house together and have children. But soon things begin to change. The husband begins going out and returning at strange hours, coming to their marital bed smelling like nothing that she's ever smelled before. And then she sees him looking at her children, with a dangerous glint in his eye, a glint that she does not like at all. One day, the wife hears her husband leave, and she follows him out, only to witness his terrible transformation in the daylight. I saw the change. In his feet it was first. They got long, each foot got longer, stretching out, the toes stretching out, and the foot getting long and fleshy and white, and no hair on them. The hair began to come away all over his body. It was like his hair fried away in the sunlight and was gone. He was white all over then, like a worm's skin. And he turned his face. It was changing while I looked. It got flatter and flatter, and the mouth flat and wide, and the teeth grinning flat and dull, and the nose just a knob of flesh with nostril holes, and the ears gone, and the eyes gone blue, blue with white rims around the blue, staring at me out of that flat, soft, white face. He stood up then on two legs. I saw him. I had to see him. My own dear love turned into the hateful one. She howls in agony and in loss, and the pack comes out to help her. Together, they attack and kill this interloper, this werewolf, pretending to be an animal like them. But the grief is not gone. She goes to him, hoping that in death he may have reverted to his true wolfen form. But only the dead man lay there, white and bloody. The wife's story is a succinct, unsettling, and absolutely genius short story. So many werewolf stories are consumed by the idea of the man who is plagued by the wolf. But what of the wolf who's now stuck with this man? We're so horrified by beastly wolf activities, but what of the things that humans are capable of that wolves would be terrified of? For so long, we have been scapegoating our very worst tendencies into wolves. But what right do we have to do that, considering some of the atrocities that we've committed as humans? Le Guin's short story proves that the werewolf is capable of being a very three-dimensional monster, one that should be looked at different angles to see how it might reflect back differently on us. But you could still tell a very traditional lycanthropic narrative that took place in the modern day that was still quite frightening, and Stephen King proved this with his short story, The Cycle of the Werewolf. In the small town of Tarker's Mills, a werewolf tastes its first blood, and it's hungry for more. This story follows along in the cycle of each month's full moon, as one person in the town of Tarker's Mills faces their worst nightmare. Railroad workers, miserable women, abusers, drifters, and children, it seems that no one is safe from the beast. The terror of the werewolf is even enough to get them to cancel that year's 4th of July fireworks, something incredibly upsetting to Marty. Marty is a wheelchair-bound boy that looks forward to the 4th of July fireworks the entire year. He's devastated by the curfew that's put in place, and so his uncle takes pity on him and buys him a set of fireworks for him to set off himself. But his uncle does warn him that he should wait until nightfall to set them off, so that he doesn't wake anybody up and doesn't get in trouble. And this is almost the end of poor Marty. The werewolf sees Marty as easy prey and strikes, and he's only saved by very quick thinking, setting off a firecracker into the monster's eye and sending it running. But the next morning, no one wants to listen to the boy who cried werewolf, and his warnings fall on deaf ears. Come Halloween that year, Marty is trick-or-treating, where he notices that the local preacher is wearing a new eye patch. Remembering how he defended himself from his attack, he realizes that this is the werewolf, and he puts a plan in place that involves having his uncle get him 2 silver bullets. By New Year's that year, Marty's trap has been set, he lures the werewolf in, and he slays him. While it doesn't do anything staggeringly inventive with the werewolf myth, Stephen King's cycle of the werewolf proves that the werewolf can still be a very real and very frightening threat even in the contemporary world. And as always, King loves bringing the idea of belief versus disbelief into his stories. After all, what could be more terrifying than knowing that someone is a monster and having no one believe you? How can you even believe yourself at that point? Stephen King's short story would go a ways to establishing the werewolf as someone that belongs in small-town Americana, something that would be further reinforced by the adaptation of the short story that came a couple years later, called Silver Bullet. In 1981, another modern werewolf would hit the scene with An American Werewolf in London. While backpacking across the English moors, two young American men are attacked by a curious beast. One is killed, but the other wakes in a London hospital to find himself uninjured, but changed. As he struggles with his lycanthropic urges, and with the appearances of his rather corpse-like best friend in visions, he has to decide whether he wants to live as a monster or die as a man. This movie is the perfect blend of comedy and horror, using modern special effects with the old werewolf legend to create a very fun, very contemporary werewolf story. In 1984, Angela Carter's werewolf short stories would see their own adaptation in The Company of Wolves, a deliciously atmospheric, gothic horror fantasy film directed by Neil Jordan. The screenplay was written by Angela Carter and Neil Jordan working together, and it loosely adapts elements of all three of the werewolf stories, but it mostly takes its inspiration from The Company of Wolves, hence the title. They frame the narrative as if it's a dream that a modern girl is having, a dream of the all-too-familiar Little Red story. As the multiple layers of this tale unfolds, it diverges from the source material by having the story conclude with Little Red turning into a werewolf herself and running off to the forest with her new wolf lover. The little girl who had first had the dream wakes to find a pack of wolves streaming through the window of her real-world home. In my opinion, it would have been next to impossible to perfectly adapt Angela Carter's wolf stories into a movie. The language is very important to these stories. The medium is very important to these stories, because she is in essence writing a short story fairy tale, like so many fairy tales before it, but the tone and the language is how she creates the anti-fairy tale effect. But by using the framing device of having this be a story that a modern-day little girl is dreaming, you do end up getting some layers of the meta-narrative involved, because there's certain storytelling things that she is, technically aware of, and these layers build pretty well to create a story that isn't as concise and as expert as the original short stories, but does have a very similar effect. This is a bizarre, moody, and kind of difficult film to follow, which means that it's right up my alley, but it's definitely not going to be to everyone's taste. But I actually think that makes it even closer to the source material. Nothing that Angela Carter wrote was trying to spoon-feed a message to you. None of these stories were meant to tell you how to live your life. They were meant to challenge you. They were meant to make you think, make you work for the story that you thought she should be telling. The stories of Angela Carter and The Company of Wolves are fiercely feminist, strange, and they evade categorization. They lull you in with stunning visuals and engaging atmosphere just to clobber you over the head with a story that makes you reconsider everything that you thought you knew about fairy tales. But, as always, balance is key, and not every werewolf story was trying to peel back the layers of society and make some grand statement. Some of these werewolf stories were just good old plain fun. 1985's Teen Wolf is the classic high school coming-of-age story with a lycanthropic twist. Scott is a nerdy, unpopular kid who's not very good at basketball and can't even get the girl he likes, but that all changes when his body begins to transform. It turns out that Scott is a werewolf just like his father, the genetic curse passed from father to son. And while his father does wish that this curse had skipped his son so that he might live a perfectly normal life, he thinks that this might be a chance for Scott to figure out who he is. He tells him, "The werewolf is a part of you, but that doesn't change what you have inside." At first, Scott is horrified by this whole thing, and he does everything that he can to avoid transforming. But then, he wolfs out during a basketball game, and uses his supernatural skills to win the game, and suddenly the whole school is enamored with him, as long as he's in wolf form. Scott suddenly is scoring new friends, his dream girl, a role in the school play. He's the king of the basketball team. He gets everything he wants, as long as he's the wolf. But Scott soon realizes that this is a shallow kind of popularity, that no one there really likes him for who he is, and so he decides that he is no longer going to use the crutch of his werewolf form. Scott helps his team win the championship game without any wolf powers at all, and there is merriment all around. This movie, although definitely goofy and definitely fun, represents an interesting shift in our conception of the werewolf mythos. The idea that being a werewolf could be something cool, that it could be something that makes you friends, is so completely antithetical to the image of the werewolf that decades of filmmaking have been building up. But I think that this shift can be attributed to a number of changing social factors. As of this movie coming out, it's been like 50 years-ish since the Wolfman was first brought into the limelight, and years of cinema have proven that people want to see monsters like this. People love the Wolfman. There's a reason they kept putting him in movies all the time. He was kinda cool, he was different, and he could make a profit. And in an environment like that, where being an oddity could get you attention at the very least, it's not surprising that someone being able to turn into a werewolf would become a local attraction. Once upon a time, being different was enough to make you a bogeyman, and the werewolf myth drew from that place of fear. But as mass communication turned difference into popularity, into gimmicks, and into profit, the lesson of the monster movie went from being one that made you fear difference to being one that made you fear sameness. In Teen Wolf, Scott's journey of growth is of him realizing that he's not special, or at the very least that the things that make him special are not how he looks or what he inherited or what he can do for people, but who he truly is on the inside. It wouldn't be long before we would see another Teen Wolf, but this one certainly isn't a golden boy like good old Scotty. Ginger Snaps is a gruesomely fun horror flick that takes on the concept of the female werewolf with gusto. Historically speaking, there's always been a somewhat unspoken relationship between werewolves and menstruation. Even if you went back to the very earliest days, when people were waiting on the cycles of the moon to hunt, it has also been theorized that men would wait to hunt until the women of their clan, their village, or their family were all on their periods. That way the women could take care of their bloody business while the men took care of theirs. Beyond that, it happens once every 28-ish days, kind of akin to the rhythm of the moon, and menstruation brings on things like cramps, pain, sudden changes of the skin and the hair, and of course, plenty of blood. I do actually have this personal theory that werewolves came about from a fear within men about what if men had to deal with something like periods, but that's a subject for another video. Either way, Ginger Snaps takes on the idea of monstrous menstruation with gusto, starring two teenage sisters who are just on the precipice of womanhood. Ginger and Bridget are morbid, loner teens with no friends except for each other. They've made a pact that the two of them will be together to the very end, no matter how soon that end comes. And that vow is put to a test when one night, while they're out on an attempted prank, Ginger gets her first period. The smell of her blood attracts the local beast that's been going around and slaughtering house pets, and it attacks Ginger. The monster's hit by a car, but Ginger ends up with a bite to show for it. A bite that heals miraculously fast. Bridget watches as her sister undergoes a sudden, violent tumble into womanhood. She starts trying drugs, having sex, going out with boys, and growing a tail. Ginger becomes prone to fits of violence, and as Bridget looks desperately through folklore and medicine for a cure for this disease, she and Ginger drift apart. Bridget ends up having to kill her own sister, rather than allowing the monster to persist. As much as this is a really fun, campy, and stylish horror movie, it is also distinctly tragic. It's an accelerated dramatization of a very real, very scary process that happens as your body begins to change in ways that you can't necessarily predict or control. Not having gone through these changes herself, Bridget feels left behind, and Ginger feels like her sister no longer likes her now that she's become a new person. In this movie, lycanthropy acts as a kind of super accelerated puberty, one that rips away the illusion of innocence of childhood and forces your most taboo, dark, and violent impulses to the surface. As Ginger explains,
I did this at age, and I thought it was for sex, but it's to tear everything into fucking pieces.
This movie takes on the fears of growing up, of changing, the very culturally significant fear of the female body, and brings it all up to 11, showing what true female monstrosity could look like. There was a sequel to Ginger Snaps, which was interesting and played out right after the events of the first movie, but I actually think that the third film in the franchise is my favorite. In 2004's Ginger Snaps Back, The Beginning, we're brought way back through time to 19th century Canada. The film stars Ginger and Bridget, but it's Ginger and Bridget back then. It's suggested that these characters are perhaps ancestors, or just some kind of a spiritual predecessor to Ginger and Bridget. It's not really clarified one way or another if it's like reincarnation or what, but you just kind of have to suspend your disbelief for that, and you're already watching a werewolf movie, so I assume that's pretty suspended when you're going into it. Ginger and Bridget's parents die in a shipwreck, and they're abandoned in the wilderness of Canada. They stumble across a few ruined Native American camps, and eventually seek refuge in an isolated trading fort. As tensions build between the all-male residents of the fort and these female interlopers, as starvation presses in close, they reveal to the girls that they've been at war with monsters for weeks. The monsters outside the gates are based loosely on the werewolves of the Loup-Garou tradition, drawing in some certain traits from Native American Wendigos, but they really act as the perfect external impetus to amp up the tension inside the gates. There's constant paranoia over who might have been infected, when they're going to attack next, how they will defend themselves or get food. And it isn't long before Ginger herself is bitten. Ginger's terrible transformation begins, but due to the stakes, the setting, and the external factors, this feels like much more than just a thinly veiled menstrual metaphor. Now, don't get me wrong, I do love a menstrual metaphor, but it is also kind of refreshing to see a female young adult coming of age story that doesn't revolve entirely around the concept of puberty. Ginger and Bridget aren't just dealing with the threat of their bodies changing, they're dealing with the world as they know it changing. Suddenly, they don't have parents. They're in a new and strange country. They're trying to contend with what it's like to be colonizers in a place that has already been settled by Native American people. They're dealing with a level of sexism and vitriol that they've never had to deal with before. And all of these factors mean that instead of the movie being about the two sisters drifting apart, about their relationship being split up, this story brings the sisters closer together. Ginger opens the movie by describing the bond that the two share.
A bond that would not be broken. That was our promise. Above all, above men, above God, above fate. It was in our blood. Together forever.
Even as everyone is urging Bridget to kill Ginger, to save herself, even as Bridget fears for her own life at her sister's hand, she refuses to do her harm. For her part, Ginger is able to gain some sort of mastery over her monstrous instincts if it means keeping her sister safe. As they said, their bond transcends everything. It transcends traditional reason and logic, and even though the fact that Bridget does not kill Ginger means that the curse lives on, and it's implied that this is part of the reason they were cursed in the modern-day First Ginger Snaps movie, they hold true to each other in a way that is tragic, but is beautiful. Now, I am aware that this entire conversation is basically just me admitting that I have a serious bias towards period films, that is, films that take place in a historical period, not films about periods. But I really do often find the werewolf monster metaphor to be much more fruitful when it's not taking place in a modern setting. Most modern werewolf stories can't help but have a little bit of cynicism for the myth. It's a kind of sardonic humor that they have towards the concept of a werewolf really being real. There seems to be an underlying knowledge that if things got bad enough, you could always just, call in the army and have them nuke the werewolves off the planet or something. I'm not going to say that you can't do a modern werewolf story well and you can't generate fear with that, but I feel like our modern arrogance, the idea that we know everything about what's out there in the world, keeps some contemporary werewolves from having a real bite. But the past, well, the past is a strange and shadowed place, ripe for fictional deviation. The past was back when they believed in everything, when these monsters were real, not because they were physically real, but because people's imaginations were still flexible enough that they could truly fear something that we now know isn't possible. Without science or reason there to guide you, you can see how the werewolf becomes not just a physical threat, but a spiritual threat, an existential threat. Now, I don't think that every werewolf film has to take place in the past, although they probably would if I had it my way. But by comparing a movie like Ginger Snaps to Ginger Snaps Back, we get a really clear look at just how much of a role setting plays when it comes to the development of a monster. Setting isn't just the icing on the cake, it is the cake, fundamentally changing the way that people think, the way they see the world, and their willingness to believe, and thus to fear. Of course, not everyone in the past blindly and foolishly believed everything that they were told, and some historical fiction werewolf movies use that as the hinge of the plot. 2001's The Brotherhood of the Wolf is a fictionalized account of the attacks of the Beast of Gevaudon. As the beast ravages the French countryside, the crown sends in a professional wolf hunter, of course joined by his Iroquois hunting companion. As they try to get to the bottom of this mystery, the movie is less of a horror and more of an action mystery film, with plenty of stylized martial arts sequences. It's part of the tradition of stories like The Cycle of the Wolf that rely on the tension of knowing that someone amongst the cast is the werewolf, but not knowing precisely who that person is. And, as it turns out in the film, it's not actually a werewolf at all, but a lion who has been abused and manipulated by a person in order to do these terrible deeds. And that is actually a really interesting adaptation of some ideas around what may have actually happened in the Beast of Gévaudan legend. Rather than feeling like a supernatural horror, this movie proved that werewolves could be a fascinating twist even to a historical mystery, which indicates that the monster had long since broken free of its purely monstrous origins. Dog Soldiers was another action horror film that came out just a year later, and it follows a group of British soldiers as they meet the unthinkable in the forests of North Wales. This movie didn't try to revolutionize the werewolf formula, but they put an interesting emphasis on the human intelligence of the monsters. Just as the human soldiers were working together, communicating, and making plans, so are their werewolf opponents. By taking advantage of the isolated setting and the implicit threat of the wilderness, and by imbuing these monsters with human cunning, Dog Soldiers makes for a very fun, very thrilling modern werewolf horror. Now, speaking of modern werewolves, we unfortunately can't get much further in this discussion without bringing up Stephenie Meyer's Twilight. Now, I just want to get this out of the way. I am not a fan of the Twilight books or movies, and I'm going to criticize them here, But I am not just criticizing them because they are written for teenage girls. I think that there are a lot of things created specifically for teenage girls, and a lot of things that teenage girls like that are very cool, because just because teenage girls like something, that doesn't automatically make it bad. And if you start to dislike something just because you hear that teen girls also like that thing, you might want to check yourself for sexism real quick. But all of that being said, I do not like Twilight, and especially the Werewolves of Twilight, because I feel like there is very little consideration or follow-through put into the origins and the implications of these monsters. The lore of these werewolves states that they are a part of the Native American Quileute tribe, which is an actual Native American tribe, by the way. In the book, these Quileute warriors used to be able to exit their bodies and wander as spirits, and eventually they started taking on wolf form to protect their tribe. Now they shapeshift specifically to protect themselves from the Cold Ones, aka the vampires. And according to Stephenie Meyer herself, this lore is based off of existing real stories told by the Quileute tribe. She says, "I did quite a bit of research on the Quileutes, the nation that Jacob and Billy belong to. All of the legends in the books are part of their tradition, the werewolves and so on. The only legend that is not a part of the Quileute tradition is the part I devised specifically to fit the Cullens." Now, it is great that Stephenie Meyer did her research here and genuinely represented an underrepresented and marginalized culture within her story, except that she's not really telling the truth. These stories that she integrated into Twilight are not Quileute stories. There are some wolves in their stories, but those stories go that humans were once wolves that were turned into humans. There's no shape-shifting tradition in their storytelling tradition. They did not think that people shape-shifted. And sure, yes, authors completely rewrite myths to use in their stories all the time, but the problem is, first of all, that she claimed to be using the real stories of these people, even though that's not true, and second off, the legends and the Native American characters that she writes can reinforce a lot of harmful stereotypes. For example, her werewolf characters are, on the whole, hot-headed, impulsive, and prone to outbursts, especially when compared to the cool, collected Cullen vampires. Her Native American werewolf characters are constantly walking around shirtless. They're described as sexy and attractive, but in a very exotic way, you know, different from normal attractive. And this all just goes to reinforce some very harmful stereotypes about Native American people that would paint them out to be violent, short-tempered, and over-sexualized. And that's not even to bring up the very uncomfortable comparisons made between Jacob and Edward Cullen the vampire when it comes to trying to win over the affections of Bella. The vampire Edward is sophisticated, wealthy, classy, and white, while Jacob is rough and tumble, poor, moody, and a person of color. And then the real knife in the back there is that Bella chooses Edward over Jacob as her forever partner. She has a kind of fling with Jacob, he even pushes an unconsented kiss onto her, but in the end Bella is going to side with Edward, who's everything that Jacob is not. Now, I'm not trying to police you, I'm not saying that you can't write Native American shapeshifter characters, but you do have to think through the way that you choose to write these characters, especially when it is a character based off of a marginalized group. If she had written this character with consideration, research, and care for the context in which she was writing, this could have been a very interesting character. And you especially should not go around reskinning and retelling another person's stories and misrepresenting minority peoples when you are marketing your story to young, impressionable readers, and you definitely shouldn't go around saying, no, that's how these people really are. As the gap between man and monster begins to close in tighter and tighter in the modern day, we need to take a serious look at what traits we consistently and frequently pair with monstrosity. Just like I think that Anne Rice's paralleling of vampires and homosexuality requires some consideration and nuance, so does the old standby of having monstrous, wild werewolves associated with minority cultures. If we are going to make these monsters more and more human, we also need to take a second to consider what is monstrous within ourselves, and a story that does a really good job of that is 2012's Wolf Children. And this gives us a chance to talk about Japanese werewolves, which was a quite interesting tradition. Shapeshifting stories from Japan typically involved animals, such as raccoons or foxes, turning into humans, rather than the other way around. However, as the Western storytelling tradition has begun to bleed its way into Japanese storytelling, we do start to see some more westernized traditional werewolves. Now, the tone of these werewolf stories is typically not horror like it is in the West. In the Japanese tradition, shapeshifters weren't villains exactly, they were more troublemakers and tricksters, and so often the Japanese werewolf ends up not being a villain figure, but more of a neutral figure, if not benevolent. In fact, in many cases where we do see humans turning into wolves, that is shown as an improvement on their state of life. They're able to find simplicity and freedom as an animal that they aren't able to find as humans. And a great example of this kind of story is Wolf Children. This is the story of Hana, a young woman that falls in love with a man who she soon learns is a wolf man, someone who can transform into a wolf at will. They have 2 children together, but just after the birth of their son, the wolf man goes out hunting and is killed, leaving Hana to raise these wolf children alone. As the babies uncontrollably shift from one shape to another, she can't take them outside often for risk of them being seen. She can't even take them to get their shots because she isn't sure if she should bring them to the doctor or to the vet. The isolating and terrifying experiences of single motherhood, so often unspoken and secretive, are brought to light by the strangeness of these children. Eventually, Hana decides to move out of the big city to a dilapidated country house, where she's going to use the very last of her savings to try and keep her and her kids going. And there, she at last finds freedom and a yard for the kids to play freely in as children or as wolves, and slowly Hana learns to trust her neighbors and find community. As the children grow up, they also struggle to find their place in society. They are entirely different from other children, having been raised by a single mother, and they have no wolf parent to show them the way to properly grow up as wolf children. The fears, the tribulations, and the many bumps that come with any coming-of-age story are really enhanced and brought to life by the wolf shifter metaphor. In the end, one of the children decides to live out a human life, not repressing or ignoring their wolf side, but prioritizing their human life above all, while the youngest decides to abandon society forever and live as a wolf, never forgetting the lessons that he was taught by his human mother. The wolf is a complex and multifaceted device in this story. For Hana, it represents the stress of motherhood, the incomprehensibility of children and the way that they grow. For the children, it becomes something fearful and wonderful all at once. It is an incomprehensible freedom and joy to be able to shift like they do, but it's also a burden. A prison of sorts, something that they have to come to terms with within themselves if they want to grow up in the world. Here, the monstrousness of lycanthropy is used as a lens in a similar way to fantasy. It is a fictional sheet of glass, warped and distorted in certain places, that by looking through it allows us to see the real world all the clearer, in new and interesting ways that we might not have seen it before. In 2017, we can see another benevolent werewolf in one of my all-time favorite films, November. This is a really weird folk fantasy sort of horror film that takes place in 19th century Estonia, where folklore and fairy tales hold far more weight than reality. Amongst the walking farm equipment, the human-sized chickens, the goat plagues that can be repelled by wearing trousers on your head so that the plague thinks you have 2 asses, the werewolf almost slips under the radar of strangeness. The protagonist of this story, Lena, is trying to navigate maturing and falling in love in this very strange world, and one of her escapes is lycanthropy. It's never made quite clear in the story if Lena fully transforms into the wolf, or if she's just sending her spirit out, but she uses her wolf form to watch things that she would struggle to watch as a human, to spend time with the boy that she loves without him realizing. Lena finds freedom in this wolf form, and although I don't believe anyone else in the story is aware that she can turn into a wolf, I don't think that they would find it particularly alarming, considering that most of them regularly make deals with the actual devil. There is something truly beautiful about the levity with which this movie deals with the folklore. One might imagine this to be a pre-witch hunt world, or at least one where the fervor of France never burned too brightly. A world where superstition never became synonymous with violence and with fear. A world where the werewolf is not something that must be feared. Another benevolent werewolf comes from the 2020 film Wolfwalkers, and I truly cannot recommend this film enough. It takes place in Ireland in the mid-17th century and follows the daughter of a wolf hunter, two members of a community of settlers desperately pushing back the bounds of the native wild forest, fighting constantly with its protectors, the wolves. The girl Robin disobeys her father's wishes and goes out into the forest looking for wolves, where she comes across a girl named Maeve, who can shapeshift into a wolf, and with her pack of wolves, she is the one defending the forest. Robin has to learn to question her pre-assumed notions, and Maeve has to learn to trust a new person, and together the two of them learn how to be friends, and how to forge a new way forward in a changing world. I dare say that this film might just be the platonic ideal of the children's werewolf movie. It's clearly drawing from a well of historical inspiration. The way that the wolves shapeshift does echo back to the pre-Christian understanding of fluidity between animal and man, but there's just enough ahistorical elements thrown in there, such as the idea of lycanthropy being transmitted by bites, that it still feels familiar, and it still feels like a werewolf story. Even setting the film in 1650, when wolves and werewolves were indeed a very pressing issue in a lot of places in Europe, it shows such a respect and regard for the historical werewolf tradition, whilst also not being afraid to integrate more modern adaptations of the myth. The art is stunning, the story is accessible but not overly simplistic, and its themes of love, unity, and compromise make for a very unique take on the werewolf myth. It calls the audience to question not just the ways in which the beast might not be so beastly, but also the ways in which the concept of monstrosity itself is a social construct that might perhaps deserve deconstruction. In the 2020s, we have had our fair share of werewolf media come out, and I think that the sheer range of the material we've been having is very telling. In 2021, the gothic horror film The Cursed came out, and while I have some problems with its storytelling, I really like the way that it sets up a powerful origin story for the werewolf. Set in 19th century France, the werewolf curse is brought on when landowners violently drive a Romani clan off of their land. Since they saw this coming using their mystical powers, the Romani clan leader has a set of silver coins melted down, which are cast into werewolf fangs. She is tragically buried alive holding these fangs, but the curse is still at work. It's actually suggested that the coins that had been melted down to form these teeth may have been the coins that Judas was paid when he betrayed Jesus, which is a little bit of a leap, but also makes for a very interesting biblical connection. Either way, this curse is effective. Everyone in the town starts having these terribly vivid dreams that all include these werewolf fangs, and soon some children go to dig up the fangs. One of them is kind of hypnotized into putting them on, and as soon as they're on, he goes into a frenzy and bites one of the other kids. This kid turns into a freaky werewolf skin creature thing and starts biting other people, and it does kind of get a little bit messy and fall apart from there. But I really like the origin story of this myth being a monster created by the people that the monstrosity was then enacted against. And I especially like that it was not the Romani people themselves who became the werewolves. Rather, they just caused the people who had driven them out of their land to turn on each other, which is a really interesting inversion of a lot of the standard werewolf tropes. They even suggest that this werewolf curse is also what happened back in the attack of the beast of Gevaudon. this monstrous nature brought on by the monstrous cruelty of new people driving off people from their native land. They're basically proposing that we create monstrosity ourselves when we refuse to treat other human beings with dignity. Still, not every contemporary werewolf story involves itself in trying to craft true horror. That same year, the werewolf comedy, Werewolves Within, came out. This story gives us the classic isolated town in the winter with a kooky cast of characters that begin dropping off one by one. This story utilizes a lot of the classic campy werewolf tropes, but it still tells a pretty fresh story, and I think it gives us a decent watermark for what the werewolf has become for most people today. They're a familiar monster at this point, an easy shorthand for describing the dark things that might lurk inside people. They're not always really a scary threat, they're often goofy and a bit campy, but they're still an excellent vehicle through which to examine human nature and the kind of monsters that we crave. Werewolves have even become the fare of comforting children's media. The 2023 storybook Every Night at Midnight tells of a little boy who's upset that he can't make friends or go to sleepovers because of his nightly transformation into a wolf. This fear of difference and exclusion that so many kids experience is addressed and soothed in this book, as the boy soon realizes that a lot of kids change into something at night, even if not all of them become wolves. Far removed from the devilish implications of the werewolf witch hunt, the werewolf has become a useful tool proven to function in every genre. Werewolves have made their name in games such as the in-person mystery deduction game, aptly titled Werewolf, and in video games such as the narrative horror video game The Quarry. We have had seasons and seasons of television about the life and times of the teen wolf. The lycanthrope has been so thoroughly absorbed into the landscape of monstrosity that any supernatural story that has things like vampires or even aliens or demons and angels, it's probably going to have a werewolf at some point. Even Tolkien had a werewolf in the Legendarium of the Lord of the Rings. This year, there was even a remake of The Wolfman, which was not particularly well received, and I'll be honest, I didn't watch it because it didn't seem very good, but it proves that this story is still present, and people are still considering and reconsidering the werewolf. I know that in about a year, Robert Eggers is slated to put out his take on the werewolf movie, which I am so excited for. Between his mastery of the material in The Northman, his reverent adaptation of Nosferatu, and his depth of understanding of historical psychology and society in The Witch, I already know I will love this movie. It doesn't hurt that I've heard it's also going to be in Middle English, which is just really exciting to me. And I would like this to count as my formal plea to anyone that has anything to do with anything, please get me invited to the premiere of this movie. I don't know if it works for me to sit here and just beg to get invited to cool things, but if ever there was something that I should get invited to the premiere of, I feel like it should be this. All the way at the beginning of this video, so like 2 hours ago for you watching, I tried to start out by defining what a werewolf was, and I failed. And that hasn't changed. After all, it's not like all these monsters I talked about today have a whole lot of similar defining traits. They're not even called the same things. Sometimes they're werewolves, sometimes they are lycanthropes, and sometimes they're loups-garous. Sometimes this condition is a curse, sometimes it's a gift, sometimes they're born with it, other times it is thrust upon them. Sometimes this involves full moons and silver bullets and pentagrams and wolfskins, etc., and sometimes it doesn't involve any of those things, and yet we do still think of them as werewolves. So, what is a werewolf? I propose that at its heart, a werewolf is the depository for all of the things that we find most fearful within the human condition. We take our darkest thoughts and impulses, the things we know we are capable of when our stomachs growl, when the cold night closes in and our fur grows thin on protruding ribs. We take all of these terrible things that decency tells us we must avoid and repress at all costs, and we scapegoat them, we release them into the werewolf. Yes, the nature of these fears changes over time. What was once terror around cannibalism and violence and sexuality has become fears of difference, of maturity, of the unknown, of the world around us. But what has not changed is just how useful the werewolf is when you want to avoid accountability. It allows us to use the excuse of monstrousness for what is often just human nature. And you might even argue, and I would agree, that in recent years, we've started to allow this beast out of the shadows, that we've welcomed it a bit closer to the fire, that we've seen the shape of its face and not allowed ourselves to look away and pretend that it's not really there before we scared it off back into the dark forest. But, as with all monsters, this festering pustule to which we've tried to sequester the infection away, this rotting blister that we try to pretend isn't even really there, it's not going to stay closed forever. Someday, the full moon will rise, and that monster we've pushed deeper and deeper within will claw and chew and tear its way out of our guts. And at that point, we can either lock our doors tight, we can hide underneath our tables as the monster rips down our doors, or we can go out and face it, and see who makes it in the end. The unfortunate reality of videos such as this one is that I cannot talk about every werewolf in history, and without a doubt, I bet that I was not able to talk about your favorite werewolf. So I hereby give you full permission to use the comments section to tell me about whatever werewolves you love, and the way that they fit into this terribly monstrous puzzle. And I will just say now that I will probably be making more videos about werewolves or involving werewolves in the future, because, as is always the case, there was a lot of material that I wasn't able to cover in this video, this already obscenely long video, so be sure to subscribe if you want to check those out when they eventually come out. Videos like this are so much fun for me to do, and so rewarding, and they're also so challenging. If you ask my roommates, they'll tell you I've just been watching werewolf things for like 5 hours a day for like the last 2 weeks straight, on top of the reading. But that also means that when you guys show so much support for videos like this, it really just makes it all worth the while. If you do want to see more big deep dive videos like this, be sure to give this video a like and share it with your most Halloween-y friend, because that really helps get the video out there and just get it onto more people's feeds. But just you being here and watching this video, commenting, and liking is so helpful. I never know how to end videos like this because it feels so inappropriate to use my regular outro, but it also would wound me if I didn't tell you this. So thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.